All right, we're continuing now with the notes for Chapter 1. We're going to cover sections 5 through 9 of the notes in this part of the video, and it's going to take us through the history of broadcasting from the 20s right on through to the advent of television and continuing on into the 50s and the early 60s. So here we go. Most of the early broadcasting in the 1920s was basically radio and electronics manufacturers. Really, radio was seen as a tool for these companies to help them to be able to sell their own products, whether they were in the furniture making business or in the clothing business or whatever else they happened to be in. Radio wasn't necessarily seen as the means to the end of itself. It was much more as a assistant to be able to sell what the company thought was its main line of business. So programming in and of itself, in a way, was kind of secondary. I mean, they wanted to provide content that listeners would be attracted to, but the main purpose was for them to be able to promote and sell their other products and services. The first that we really see of any sort of advertising in the way that we kind of think of it today was when AT&T brought on what they called toll broadcasting. Toll broadcasting, I should say. This is a system in which people would pay to come to a radio station and then deliver a message. So you would call up the radio station, you'd have a message that you would want to deliver to somebody, you'd pay the radio station a certain amount of money, and then you would actually go to the studio and you would be able to give the message yourself. Three main reasons for the development of radio networks now. First off was economic. It was less expensive for one station to produce a program and then have it broadcast simultaneously over several stations. So what we're seeing here is that where you have radio stations popping up all over the country, you are finding that it's going to be hard to provide live content by every station at every part of the day that the radio station is on the air. So these networks would form in order to be able to have content that could air on multiple stations at the same time. Second, the audience. Listeners in rural areas wanted better programming. And this way, with the networks, they could get the same quality programs that were being put on by radio stations in New York, in Los Angeles, in Chicago, and they could have the same content coming in their small town. Thirdly, advertisers. They wanted a larger reach for their programming. Networks provided the ability for one advertiser to advertise on one program to several radio stations in several markets across the country. In 1926, David Sarnoff spun off the National Broadcasting Company from AT&T, consisting of the Red Network and the Blue Network. So NBC actually was two different networks with two different streams of programming in the early days. And each network would have different content, would be available to different radio stations, and this is how NBC started off in the networking business. A couple other networks from the late 20s, early 30s. CBS, the Columbia Broadcasting System, came on the air in 1927. William Paley was the one that founded that. And then in 1934, the Mutual Broadcasting System was created. So NBC, with its two networks, plus CBS, plus Mutual, were the four pioneers of network radio programming. Some of the impacts of network programming. First off, networks provided for advertisers nationwide exposure for their products. Again, it solved that problem that advertisers were looking for, to be able to get as large of a reach as they possibly could. Second, networks provided programming that was first limited to the urban areas. Now it's made available to rural areas, so the audience gets bigger. and the audience can now enjoy programming from no matter where they are. And the folks in New York, Pennsylvania could hear the same stuff in Iowa, Illinois, and anywhere else across the country. Thirdly, political campaigns became truly national in scope. Prior to this, political candidates would have to go from city to city, town to town, and do their campaigning. Now they could use the power of radio to be able to reach a large audience at one time. So the 20s and early 30s was a time for the radio boom, where radio stations were showing up all over the country. But there were some problems logistically, so some rules had to start coming up. It actually goes back to 1910, where the Wireless Ship Act was the first regulation for wireless communication in the United States, requiring passenger vessels to carry wireless sets. Keep in mind that in the early days of radio, it was meant for more point-to-point communication. So this act made it so that it was mandatory for ships to be able to have these radios so that they could be communicated with. Then the Radio Act of 1912 required sending stations to be licensed by the Secretary of Commerce, who could assign wavelengths and time limits. So in this aspect, the government started getting involved in making sure that certain licensees would be able to operate on certain frequencies so that another operator wouldn't trounce all over someone else's allotted frequency. The Radio Act of 1927 was developed to regulate long-form broadcasting. As commercial radio stations were coming into play, this started to create the rules that we're starting to see more and more as they are related to what we think of as broadcasting today. Here's some key components of that. First off, the radio spectrum was deemed to be a national resource. Again, it wasn't owned by any particular person or any particular company. It was something that was under the purview of the federal government. Second, licensees would have to operate in the public interest because it is a national resource and it's not owned by any person or company, that it's something that the federal government oversees. Licensees would have to agree that the things that they do on the air would have to serve some sort of benefit to the public at large. Thirdly, government censorship was forbidden. And this is an important piece too, because if the government is controlling the licensees and when they can broadcast and all those sorts of things, there also has to be that First Amendment protection of freedom of speech. So the idea of censorship was going to be off the table. Fourth, the creation of the Federal Radio Commission, the FRC. So this is the governing body that in the beginning days oversaw all the different licenses and the rules and all that as it related to radio. The FRC then was replaced in 1934 by the FCC, the Federal Communications Commission, which is the agency we know today, and that came about as a result of the Communications Act of 1934. Radio in the 1930s and 40s grew exponentially in several ways. It grew in the number of stations, in the number of receivers, in the numbers of employees, and also the amount of advertising revenue that was realized by radio stations. And keep in mind, that's an important thing because this happened during the Great Depression. There's a lot of factors that come into play there. Radio became a much more affordable way for people to be able to be entertained at home instead of spending money going to the theater or movies or other sorts of entertainment that you would leave your home for. And it made it a great captive audience for those that were operating radio stations and the advertisers that wanted to reach that audience, because even in times of depression, people need to spend money on certain basic necessities, and some people still were able to buy different luxuries and things like that. So radio was a booming business even in the middle of the Great Depression. Now, up to this point, we've been talking about AM radio. What about FM? Well, FM didn't really come onto the scene. It took some time for FM to be able to materialize itself. FM was actually developed in the late 30s into the 40s, but it struggled for several reasons. First off, companies wanted a return on the investments they've made in AM radio. So at this point, we're now 25 years into AM radio having been out there. A lot of money has been invested in equipment and developing those stations and developing the reputations of those stations. So people still wanted, the owners rather, wanted to continue to see their investment of AM be able to be realized. Second, developments in television were emerging, and we'll talk a little bit more about that in just a bit. With television on the scene, why invest in another aspect of audio-only entertainment, was the argument of some. Thirdly, World War II stopped any sort of development because engineers were being used for the war effort. And fourthly, the FCC changed spectrum allocation that would have been assigned to FM radio stations. So any FM radios that were out there at that point wound up becoming obsolete because of that change. 1943, the FCC forces NBC to sell off its blue network, and it keeps the red network, so the red network becomes what we know of as NBC now. The blue network gets purchased by Edwin Noble, and it becomes ABC, the American Broadcasting Company. So the impact of all of this, radio in the 30s into the 40s, radio becomes the number one source of home entertainment. Radio delivers news reports with immediacy that help distinguish it from newspapers. So there's the fact that you could turn on your radio and know what is happening right now. Social action also became very prominent as a result of radio. Franklin Roosevelt developed his fireside chats while he was president during the Great Depression. Orson Wells, with his now famous War of the Worlds radio broadcast that caused a bit of a stir in some people that, well, what happened was some people turned into the broadcast a little bit late, and Orson Wells announced that this was a fictional story, that it was not something that was true. But as the story progressed, the story, by the way, about aliens coming to invade Earth, there were people that were listening, and they thought it was a real news story, and it caused a bit of angst in many people. Also, Kate Smith. She is famous for singing Irving Berlin's God Bless America. Well-respected actress and singer of the time. She had her own variety radio show. One of the things she did during World War II was broadcast an 18-hour radio marathon in order to raise money for war bonds for the World War II effort. Fourthly, radio and recording companies did not have much of a relationship back at this time. Recording companies saw radio as a bit of a threat. The radio companies wanted the abilities to be able to broadcast music, but the recording companies were afraid that if they let radio air their music, then, well, why would people go out and buy records? So in the beginning, you had a lot more programming types of things on the radio airwaves, and not as much music. So speaking of those programs, just about every genre of programming that's now prevalent in television was available on radio at the time. You had various comedy shows and you had various crime shows, some of those listed in the textbook and listed on your screen here. different types of dramas and soap operas. Yeah, the guiding light got its start in radio. Also, the Great Depression and World War II gave rise to news on the radio, again, providing a sort of immediacy that newspapers couldn't necessarily deliver on. So radio was very much in its heyday during that time. And then we start to see the development of television. People got their first look at television in 1939. RCA premieres the television at New York's World's Fair, radio with pictures. And people were amazed at the ability to be able to view things on a screen. A couple of developments that helped make television possible are thanks to these two gentlemen, Vladimir Zworykin and Philo Farnsworth. Zworykin was working for RCA, and he developed the iconoscope, and it was basically the eye of an electronic TV camera. Farnsworth developed a similar sort of technology that he called an image dissector. And these two technologies helped to be able to make the television in its early days possible. Scientists during World War II greatly improved the U.S. system of radar and also advanced the technical side of TV at the same time. So while scientists and engineers were giving a lot of their effort to World War II, it didn't mean that television in particular did not benefit from the things that these folks were busy doing when they weren't working for the television and radio companies. The way that they developed radar was a huge help to the development of television in particular. In 1948, the FCC declared a freeze on new television station applications when while studying the future of television. What they were trying to do was to prevent sort of the mess that happened with the beginnings of radio and how different companies and different radio broadcasters would cause interference with other radio stations in other places. So there was only a limited number of licenses that were given for television, and then they wanted to try to prevent that sort of mess of happening with TV. So the freeze was put into place by the FCC. Then in 1952, we get from the government the 6th Report and Order. And here's some of the things that that order did. First off, a table of channel assignments was created that was going to be standard throughout the country. It opened up channels 14 through 69 for television. Up to this point, only channels 2 through 13 were being used by TV. 14 through 69 is developed on a separate band of radio waves called the UHF band, or ultra high frequency. Third, it set standards for color television. And then fourthly, channels were set aside for non-commercial television. And this is setting the way for what we're eventually going to know as public television. We're not quite there yet. That hadn't been developed in particular, but the FCC was setting that into place, that there would be some non-for-profit TV. TV's effects on radio, well, there were several. First off, major market advertising moved from radio to TV. Again, the attraction of radio with pictures. And there's more that you can do when you can show a viewer what it is that you're selling, as opposed to just telling them through radio. Secondly, radio turned to specialized audiences through the development of particular formats, including Top 40 and the use of the disc jockey. So we're starting to see the recording companies play ball a little bit more with radio at this point. And these particular formats were coming into play. If you liked a certain type of music, you would turn to a particular radio station. Prior to that, radio stations tended to be general audience and would offer certain things for certain audiences at certain times to try to cover a variety of tastes. Now we're starting to see more segmentation in radio. Thirdly, radio and record companies came closer together, as I just mentioned. Basically, what happened was the record companies started to see airplay of their artists on radio stations as free advertising for the record labels. And the radio stations got programming as a result. Fourthly, radio becomes more dependent on local advertisers. Since the national advertisers aren't there as much anymore, radio stations now going out into their communities, soliciting advertising revenue from their local mom and pop businesses. TV's growth curve from 53 through 62, radio grew exponentially in number of stations, in number of receivers, in number of employees, and in advertising revenue, just like radio did in its heyday. But now here we are in the 50s, radio with pictures, people are embracing it, and it is starting to see its boom. A couple of wrinkles, though, to happen as a result. In 1956, Ampex Corporation introduces videotape recording. Now, this really helped television stations in that it made program production cheaper and it lessened the need for live performances. Up to that point, everything that was on TV was being done live. Now, you can record something and play it back at a later time, or you can record it at one location and air it at another location at a later time. 1961, the FCC persuades Congress to pass the All-Channel Receiver Bill, requiring TV manufacturers to include UHF on its TVs. Up to that point, many TV manufacturers were just including channels 2 through 13. Now they have to include 14 through 69. Also in 1962, Telstar becomes the first active communications satellite, allowing transatlantic signal relay, and this becomes what we know as cable TV today, started off as community antenna television. We'll talk more about that in detail in later chapters. Now, just as recording companies had a bit of an issue with radio in its boom, in its heyday, television didn't get Hollywood to play ball with them right away either. The FCC did not favorably receive applications for stations from movie studios, and as a result, studios saw TV as competition and would not allow movies or its actors to appear on TV. Economics, though, eventually brought those two worlds together. In 1953, ABC and United Paramount Theaters had merged, so now you have major film studios seeing that they can make money by producing series for television. So the movie actors are now going from the big screen onto the small screen. And then in 1987, 20th Century Fox establishes the Fox network. Other production houses follow suit with their own networks or mergers and alliances with established networks. We'll talk a little bit more about that phenomenon when we get into the next section of notes, which we will continue with in the next video.